short introduction. Welcome and thanks for coming today to hear our presentation by Dr. Matt Rafalow on digital divisions, how schools create inequality in the tech era. I'll just say a few words and then ask Matt to get going. But Matt is a sociologist by training, having earned his PhD at UC Irvine in sociology in 2016. And prior to that, he took his master's in sociology and education at Columbia University Teachers College. He currently works as a senior researcher at Google, and as he has told us, working in YouTube research. He leads a program on live streaming experiences there, but at the same time, he has been a visiting scholar in UC Berkeley's Center for Science, Technology, Medicine, and Society. He's a very accomplished scholar as well as an engaged developer and researcher, having publications in all kinds of important outlets. Recently, the Oxford Handbook of Sociology and Digital Media, and such well-known outlets as the American Journal of Sociology, the Journal Symbolic Interaction, the Journal Digital Culture and Education, and quite an extensive reader. We're very glad he could join us today. I'll stop my fuzzy mic speaking and turn it over to Matt Rafalow. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Joe. That's a super generous introduction. And I like that we're maybe a group of 7 or 8. Usually I make a call to like, oh, we'll use the chat and let's keep the chat alive, keep the conversation going. But perhaps it can be even more interactive than that, given those of us here. So basically, this is a presentation based on findings from my new book. And when I was doing this research, I certainly didn't imagine we'd be living in the, I hope it's fair to say, hellscape that we're in the educational sector, with everyone being forced to use digital tools to teach. But hopefully what I share is generative in some way, and I really look forward to your feedback and questions. So I usually like to start, and I think Joe anticipated this quite beautifully, just sharing a little bit about what I do. Sociologists, at least, have no idea what it means when I say I'm a researcher in tech. But I did outline some of that. I work on a product team. I do applied research and academic research, and the new academic work I'm doing is actually centered on influencers, what it means to be one, why people tune into them. And I'm happy to talk about that after if folks are curious. But I also have this visiting appointment at Berkeley, which is really, really fun, and it lets me kind of flex different muscles, mostly academic at UC Berkeley and mostly applied at Google. So my academic work follows 2 strands primarily, all with a sociological lens for the most part, to understand why people use technologies in the way that they do. So in the first, which I'm going to be presenting on today, I try to understand how educational institutions shape the way we interpret the meaning and value of digital tools, and in ways that lend to inequities. And in the second, and this is where I'm really dipping a lot into comm literature and HCI especially, is how, in broader online publics, how, using different empirical cases, what shapes digital interaction in those settings and to what effects. And so I've studied online dating and how awful that can be. Just as awful as in person, but specifically looking at sexual racism online. I've also studied massive online learning communities. And as I mentioned, I'm now studying what it takes to be an influencer. And so those are kind of the broad areas of focus. So for an outline of what I hope to share today, I'm going to start by just discussing the theories I'm playing with, and then very briefly go through the methods so I can get to the fun stuff, the findings. And I'll mostly be speaking about findings from chapter 2 and a little bit on chapter 4, which get at how it is that teachers treat kids' digital play and to what effects. I won't be really getting into the why, which is why teachers are doing this and so differently by the race and class of their student body, which is the bulk of chapter 3. That really centers on theories of race and organizations, workplace culture. And if you're, as you're listening, you're wondering like, oh, well, these are interesting case studies. How would this work in other schools, Matt? That's kind of where I get at some of that thinking. So I'm happy to talk about that after if folks want. And then lastly, I'll share a little bit of some of my thinking as anybody who studies technology right now, everybody's getting, well, what about COVID? How does that work right now? So I have a little bit at the end that are just some implications for all of this craziness we're going through right now. So before I get into it though, I usually like to play a little game, if you'll pardon the pun here. Usually when I give this talk, some people in the room are gamers or they have kids that are gamers. And I would just take a second and think like, when you hear of video games like this, like, what do you think of them? Do you think, and usually I'll say like, drop in the chat, like one word thing you feel, no pressure to do that since we're a smaller group, but do you think Minecraft is fun? Do you think it's distracting? Do you think it's, amazing? Really just give some thought as to what your gut sense is when you think of games like this. And I'll come back to this, but something to just kind of think about. All right, so in the 2000s or so, the early 2000s, late 90s, when all this digital technology stuff was really taking off, a newer wave of tech taking off, you really couldn't miss the sheer volume of prophetic idealism about the power of technology in changing learning. I mean, technology will change the classroom, some of these perspectives would say. Technology will bring us the future of learning. My favorite is technology is the great equalizer. And when I started thinking about this work, this was really the predominant frame of thought, when I expressed interest in this topic, the kind of language that folks would bounce back at me with. And one interesting piece of this puzzle too, I think, is that young people were among the first adopters of many of these new digital tools relative to us, perhaps older folks. And so from one point of view, I thought, wow, well, maybe they're learning something while they're playing around with these digital tools, and maybe they could put them to work in the classroom to help them get ahead. That was, I think, some of the thinking around this idealism as well. But then in 2015, I started reading about this news story featuring a 14-year-old in Texas who was actually quite good at these same types of digital skills that these idealist views of technology had described. His name was Ahmed. He himself was a digital tinkerer, and he had used available technology around him to quite literally build a digital clock from scratch. And this is not too far afield, I think, from these stories of Steve Jobs tinkering around in his garage to become, a respected, perhaps controversial, but at least respected innovator for our generation. But something happened that was quite different than what happened to Steve Jobs. When Ahmed brought this homemade digital clock to school, his teachers had him arrested. They handcuffed him and escorted him off campus. Innovative wasn't even remotely top of mind for these teachers who had instead believed he had made a homemade bomb and brought it to school. And I kept thinking over and over, why wasn't this kid seen as an innovator instead of quite literally a terrorist? And I think importantly, a question that I kept running through my head is, how does race factor in here in ways that shape who gets to be an innovator? And I think who gets to be an innovator is a really good question. Fast forward to today, and Black and Latinx folks still make up a tiny minority of Silicon Valley, though there have been some small gains recently in Latinx representation. But what's particularly interesting, I think, is when you look at data on leadership. The vast majority of people who are running Silicon Valley are white dudes. And I think this is a really big question that could and should and is being looked at from multiple different angles. But as I was doing this kind of educational project, I kept thinking of the story of Ahmed and his digital clock. I couldn't shake the question of what is happening in schools. How do teachers treat kids' digital skills, especially if in this era, many kids are playing with these digital technologies already? And so, stories, media stories are nice, but as academics, we are called to root it in the literatures. And so this is kind of my take on it from a sociological point of view, which many of us draw on Pierre Bourdieu. He's kind of our go-to, and I think for good reason. His theory and work by many others that extend his thinking show quite convincingly that kids' unequal childhoods have effects on their later educational attainment. And the story kind of goes like this to underscore the sociological perspective. And I think Bourdieu can be pretty unnecessarily jargony, so I try to like boil it down into these fun little stories. So the idea is if you're a kid born into a wealthy family, then it's likely that your parents are members of the dominant group of society, at least according to Bourdieu. And so in this view, wealthy parents would socialize in their kids certain habits and skills, like knowing when and how to ask for help, that Bourdieu refers to as the product of socialization as a kid's developed habitus. So then eventually the kid from this wealthy family goes to school and they start displaying those trained habits and skills, like knowing when and how to ask a teacher for help, um, in ways that, because those habits and skills are shared among the dominant class, teachers being among them, that those same skills are interpreted as signs of achievement, whether or not they're listed on the formal curriculum. And this reward of looking for similar types of skills that parents from the same class are teaching, they call that reward cultural capital. And so from this point of view, many of us Bourdieuians refer to the habits and skills that kids develop as a cultural resource, or even a currency that kids can use to get ahead. It's almost some kind of reduce it to economic exchange. I think that goes a little too far, but in theory, that's kind of the idea. Wealthy parents are able to give their kids a currency that is expected in the classroom. That less wealthy kids, their parents are not as familiar with this stuff and so are not able to provide that. That's the current thinking. And so in sum, thinking around unequal childhoods argues that kids show up at school on an unequal footing. Wealthy kids will consistently succeed ahead of poor kids as a result. And the solve, as this literature would success, is one of cultural mobility. If only by some magical way, students of all socioeconomic backgrounds had similar cultural resources, we would finally see gains among working class students. So that's what the existing thinking suggests. And so, funnily enough, I think there actually is a magical way to test this theory. I watched along with the rest of the world as young people adopted digital technologies at unprecedented rates in the early 2000s. And the Pew Research Center was, I think, a stronghold in measuring this. With tempoed frequency, they captured just how fast young people were adopting relative to everybody else, things like internet-connected smartphones, laptops, iPads, and video games to connect with one another. And in a landmark book by Mimi Ito and her colleagues, they provide the most comprehensive documentation of what it is kids were doing with these technologies. And what they found, I think, really changed the learning sciences and really, I think, bolstered all this talk, at least in the contemporary moment, of digital literacies. They found that young people use digital tools to what they called hang out, mess around, and geek out, which are really kind of anthropological emic terms to describe genres of participation that kids had. But what they found is that by doing these types of things online, by playing with friends, they were actually learning digital skills along the way in order to play with friends online. They had to know how to use different hardware and software. They had to learn how to communicate with each other online, and they had to learn how to produce digital media. That could be anything from creating audio, video, images, etc. And so just to kind of summarize so far, the research questions I went into this project were, if kids showed up at school with similar digital know-how, will that give working class kids a leg up? And I think importantly, where this literature is actually very colorblind, is what about race? What about students of color? And broadly, how will teachers treat these skills from digital play when they show up, when they bring them to school? Those are kind of the broad foci for the project. So I usually like to ruin the story before I go into it, just because it helps me kind of, as I'm listening, just kind of follow along. So essentially, I argue that the answer to this question relies on an understanding of how schools differently discipline kids' digital play and do so differently by the race and class of their student body. And what I mean here critically is not just like punishing a student, like ruler wrapping. Like it's not just like that. It's actually more of a Foucauldian sense, where, but very grounded in how these scholars, Bowles and Gintis, describe the ways schools communicate different messages to children about the value of their creative worth to schooling and beyond. And importantly, Bowles and Gintis really only cared about social class. They weren't really thinking about race. But the idea that they had was that, you know, wealthy kids are treated like they're going to be future CEOs by their teachers, and so they're almost trained to do that, whereas working class kids are trained for the factory. That's kind of the underlying principle here. But one of the contributions that I hope to make is that class isn't just it. Race is really important too. And why it matters is that I find that teachers' race and class-based stereotypes of their students shape their approach to disciplining digital play. And at schools serving wealthy and white kids, they tell kids that literally every creative impulse online is essential to schooling. But at schools serving less affluent students of color, they discipline play by treating it as either irrelevant or threatening to schooling, which sets kids up differently for whether their digital skills from play can actually be educationally valuable in the classroom. So like I said, I'm going to breeze through the methods, but I'm obsessed with research design. So if folks want to talk about it, happy to. Something I find interesting is that there's not a lot of work on middle school, and I really have no idea why. Like maybe people were just so traumatized by middle school that they didn't want to go back. But I think it's a really important period to study for a bunch of reasons. We know that it's a critical period for kids' identity development. We know tracking is less likely to shape student experience than in high school. We know, I think importantly, that these are grades that are increasingly targeted for digital learning. And so it's an important period to study. But what I did was a comparative ethnographic study of 3 middle schools. I did 600 hours of observation split evenly between schools, which if I were advising students, I would not recommend from a mental health perspective, especially in 1 year. But I did all of this observation, interviewed the vast majority of faculty and staff, and I strategically sampled a group of 8th graders at each school that I interviewed at the end of the year where patterns for observation were strongest. And importantly, these were schools that I sampled on being tech utopias. I wanted to know if the school level digital divides were closed, would we see some of these prophetic claims of the great equalizer happening? And so all schools had tons of technology available to them. Very similar technologies with the exception of one school where the reasons are actually very interesting, and I'm happy to talk about it later if folks want to know more. Mostly white teacher populations at each school, similar spectrum of teacher training, but importantly, students varied by demographic. One school was mostly white and wealthy, one school was mostly middle class and Asian American, and one school was mostly working class and Latinx, serving Latinx students. All right, so the findings, so the fun stuff. So first, I think it's nice just to start with the descriptive portrait of technology access. These data are from the interviews with those students that I mentioned, but the findings are similar to informal surveys that teachers did at the school. And importantly, the purple where you see is actually Pew data on national data for similar questions. But essentially, the point here is that much like national data from Pew, we see generational similarities in basic access to digital technology, including smartphone ownership, home technology, at least one internet connected laptop, gaming system, iPad, et cetera. And importantly, there were differences in how much available technology there was, and the quality and maintenance of technology. And this is especially important today when we think about what a full online learning experience requires and digital divides that might exist as a result. And I will come back to this at the end. But for the purposes of this project, kids had enough of a baseline set of access to digital technologies that they needed to play online with friends and develop the basic digital skills touted by these other scholars. And what's interesting, as I'll talk about next, is that they weren't learning how to use these devices from parents, which is very important to Bourdieuian thinking, because remember, it's about transfer of wealthy parents to their kids. There's that parent transfer. And so I needed to know where these kids were learning how to use digital tools. And when I asked them if their parents taught them how to use technology, they pretty much, in the nicest way possible, laughed in my face. So for example, Daniel, an Asian American youth at Sheldon, said, "I'm the techie of the family. My dad is good, but I'm better." Maggie, a 14-year-old white youth at Heathcliff, said, "I know how to use programs that my parents don't even know how to use." And Bailey, a Latinx youth at Chávez, said, "My brother and I are both the tech experts of the family. We fix computers and programs together." And so I think next it's like, well, what were the things that they were learning from play online? Well, there were two genres of digital skills that they fleshed out for me that will come up again and again in what I describe soon in the classroom. And the first is online communication. And this is usually a joke that I make to sociologists who I think tend to be a little less skilled on the digital spectrum relative to other departments, but people don't just know how to communicate online, they have to learn it. And these kids needed to learn how to communicate online in order to play with friends digitally. Online communication included learning how to communicate across social media, how to text, how to collaborate online, like either on a shared document or even just planning an event digitally. And the second genre of digital skills is digital production. This could be anything from creating and sharing new media, like an audio image, all the way to coding a program, or even using a video game to create a world within a world, learning the physics and kind of production tools to be able to do that work. And what you see here is actually jailbreaking. This is not actually a Game Boy, this is an iPhone. Jailbreaking is a process of kind of going into the back end of a device and reworking it towards your aims. Usually kids, that I talk to, it's to kind of play games in ways that they want to. All of these are examples of learning digital skills in different ways towards different ends, from play specifically. So in the, how am I doing on time? Okay, cool. So in the story so far, I've learned that students at each school, no matter whether they were Asian American, white, Latinx, and no matter income, fit the national portrait of baseline digital access and basic digital skills in online communication and digital production. So the next question, of course, is what happened when students brought these digital skills from play to school? At Heathcliff, the school serving mostly wealthy and white students, teachers there saw digital skills from play as essential to school. For example, Mr. Kraus, the school technology manager, explained to me, "I always use the example of Steve Jobs going to his garage and tinkering around. Why can't the garage be at school? There's value in having school be a place where kids can come in, bring what they know for their own lives, and have their eyes light up with possibility and say, okay, I see there's something maybe I can do here and become passionate about." Over and over in interviews, Heathcliff teachers constructed kids' knowledge and skills from digital play as necessary to school success. Their predominantly wealthy and white students were seen as Steve Jobs potentials. And so, as promised, this is where Minecraft comes back in. I'll be using this as an example at each school, but keep in mind those other examples of online communication, digital production, you could replace them with this and it would be the same treatment in each school. So, and to be frank, a lot of kids at the time of the study were obsessed with Minecraft, so it just came up a lot in the classroom. So how did it appear in the classroom? Well, in day-to-day classroom life, teachers discipline kids' digital play at Heathcliff by treating it as essential to classroom learning. So for example, in a history class I observed where students were working on an assignment about ancient Egypt, they had their iPads open to do this independently. But one student I observed from the corner of my eye had Minecraft open on their device. And I was a little worried for them, to be honest, because my video games were not on the agenda for this learning activity. But the teacher saw this as he was walking around the room, leaned over her shoulder and just started asking about it. Is that a pyramid? How did you build that? And after learning enough, the teacher did, what we know a lot of middle school teachers do, where they kind of clap their hands to get everybody's attention and said to everybody, come over, look at what she did, and citing how tremendous it was that she was able to put this together during the assignment. So at Heathcliff, because teachers discipline kids' digital play in this way, students were able to bring in online video, digital art, online learning, even video gaming as helpful for classroom life. Disciplining play in this way thus activated kids' digital knowledge as cultural capital for success. So, what was it like at other schools serving less affluent students of color? Well, it was a much different story. Teachers at Sheldon Junior High, the school serving mostly middle class Asian American students, saw the digital skills kids learned from play as not essential, but threatening to school. And their rationale drew on highly racialized, overtly racialized imagery. For example, Miss Finnerty, an eighth grade teacher at the school, explained to me, I feel bad for our kids here. They grow up with a tiger mom culture and are taught from a young age to only get A's or they have failed. It's terrible. But it makes it hard for us as teachers because they're taught to do anything to do well. And that's not fair to other students. Another teacher, Miss Nisbet, who teaches seventh grade, said, we've had a bunch of suspensions this year because these Asian kids are so good at using technology that they hack our online system. One student broke into a teacher's website and locked her out. They'll do anything to do well. Sheldon teachers constructed kids' digital technology use as an extension of assumptions about Asian Americans as tiger mom raised hackers who will cheat to succeed. So their disciplinary approach to play was one that saw play as threatening to school. And this, of course, had heavy implications for how they disciplined signs of kids' digital play day to day in the class. So when Minecraft or literally any video game appeared in class, as it did when kids would just pop it open on their phone in between assignments, teachers snatched them away, put them in phone boxes in the principal's office, and students were punished heavily, often getting detentions and sometimes even suspensions. Teachers heavily policed kids' digital participation, choosing to actively monitor school Wi-Fi networks linked to students' IP addresses, in some cases printing out text message exchanges that students had with one another that they had no idea teachers were monitoring, to use them to discipline them, and using screen monitoring technology like little surveillance cameras to monitor what students were doing in real time on their computers. Needless to say, disciplining play in this way rendered the knowledge kids brought to school about digital technology as threatening, and it was not activated as cultural capital for achievement. And lastly, at the final school, Cesar Chavez Middle School, the one serving mostly working class Latinx students, they had a third approach to digital play. Their teachers saw the digital skills that kids brought to school not as essential and not even as threatening, like at Sheldon. They saw them simply as irrelevant to school. So for example, Miss Duffy, a seventh grade teacher at the school, said, these kids aren't naturally gifted at technology. Those skills playing video games, they don't translate to school. So they have fast phones, so what? The kids we teach, if we're being realistic, they need skills for hands-on jobs, like how to fix a new wave car. If it's to learn technology, it's for that purpose. Miss Geller, a sixth grade teacher at the school, explained to me, I don't know if these kids are going into managerial positions after school, but they need to know a different set of skills than it used to be in factories. They need basic skills in computers, research, programming, even making websites. That's the future for these kids. At Chavez, teachers over and over described their students as hardworking immigrants just trying to get ahead. And they, these white teachers, they saw themselves almost like parents who believed that the best way to help them is to teach them basic skills with digital technologies to at best get a new wave factory job. This meant that they followed a basic skills discourse when it came to technology. They didn't think creativity online would actually meaningfully help these kids. So those things they learned from friends online, that was irrelevant to learning. And what this meant in the classroom was super interesting to me from an academic point of view. While teachers didn't discipline or police it in the same way that we saw at Sheldon. Instead, they simply saw creativity online as a frivolous and fun reward after school. And for sociologists that love Marx, like this really rings some interesting Marxist bells because remember, Marx says that the work that institutions does is it tells factory workers that their creative selves should be divorced from work. And so instead, what these teachers did is that they favored rote digital skills that they determined were important, things like typing and the basics of coding, downplaying the value of creativity in every little project. Some of you might have heard of Scratch, this, I think, MIT-based kind of programming game that kids can play. And what's interesting is that they did use things like Scratch, but even in the use of Scratch to teach coding, teachers would say, remember, kids, I don't care how cool your SpongeBob looks that you're animating in this video. That's just for fun. What I care about is if you can solve the problem. And so in other aspects of school life too, teachers would allow students to find existing images or video for their projects, but they would never allow them to create or make digital media for their projects. So this disciplinary approach to digital play is one that treats kids' digital skills from play as irrelevant to school. And like Sheldon students, this meant that those same digital skills from play were not translated to cultural capital for achievement. So close to wrapping things up, but just to summarize, I observed three different disciplinary approaches to kids' digital play that had a direct impact on whether the digital skills kids learned from play could be activated as cultural capital for success. At Heathcliff, the school serving mostly wealthy and white students, they treated kids' play as essential to achievement. But at Sheldon and Chavez, schools serving less affluent students of color, they saw play as either threatening or irrelevant, respectively. And what this shows, without even going into why teachers are doing it in these different ways, is that our theory of cultural mobility that I mentioned earlier is false. Even if kids share a similar baseline of digital skills, a cultural resource increasingly valued by educational institutions. And especially so in the stated vision that each of these schools I recruited had, those digital skills are treated differently by the race and class of their student population. And so going back to our little chart from before, what this shows is that the prophecy of unequal childhoods is not bearing out in that unequal teacher discipline, the gatekeeping that teachers have matter. And I think the missing piece here, which is my biggest critique of the sociology of education, and really how cultural sociologists, the cultural theorists among sociology think, is that they either do not study students of color, or perhaps worse, they're quite literally ignoring racial phenomena in the schools that they're studying anyways. Kids' valued habits and skills are indeed seen as a cultural resource to get ahead, but only if you're white. The metaphor from Bourdieu should not be that if you have the right currency, you can get ahead in class. I argue that the metaphor should be schools determine whether they will even accept your currency based on your class and race. So when I usually end things here, people still have a lot of questions about how discipline play matters beyond school. So I'll share one last little bit of taste of how these different disciplinary orientations affected kids beyond the classroom. And if you're in the comm space, I think this potentially might be even more interesting to you than some of this other stuff I've been waxing on about. So what I find really crazy is that these different teacher approaches to disciplining play actually shaped how the eighth graders I interviewed view their own digital participation in and outside of school. So remember at Heathcliff, the school serving mostly wealthy and white kids, teachers told kids that what they did online was essential, their play was essential to learning. Well, in interviews, Heathcliff students told me that they learned in turn that their online participation is essential to achievement. It's essential to doing well in school. So, what they did is that they used the digital platforms they had to participate online specifically to impress teachers and to leave digital footprints that they thought would impress future colleges and future employers. Some kids, these are eighth graders, remember, had LinkedIn accounts in the service of trying to achieve this, um, to look like worthy to future colleges. And remember at Sheldon, the school serving mostly middle class Asian American youth, they were told their digital play was threatening to achievement. Well, Sheldon students in turn came to view their online participation as risky. Even if they played around publicly online, that meant that teachers could find it and punish them for presumably messing around in class, even if it was something they posted days ago while at home. So this meant that their digital footprints needed to be hidden. All of the kids I interviewed locked their social media accounts from public view to ghost, is what they called it, online, meaning that their footprints could not be traced back to them. So this meant that they did not create public presences like the Heathcliff students did, either for teachers or for future colleges or employers. It led to students' erasure of self from public view. And lastly, remember that Chavez students were told that what they did online was irrelevant to learning. It was just for fun. And what students then internalized was, okay, yeah, it's not going to help me with school, but social media and playing online is just for fun. They internalized that it just didn't matter to school. And so when they played online, it was mostly for fun with friends and family. But since schools told them that school didn't care about what they did online, they ended up curating very public digital footprints that were never intended for future employers or future college officials. Rather than looking like they're curating a digital resume, their lasting digital presence from this period of their lives was limited to messing around and having fun with friends. And so what this does is I think it creates an asymmetry by which race and class, and not just whether kids participate online, which is what I think a lot of existing survey work tries to focus on, but how they participate in ways that I think are really worthy of studying for implications beyond school, especially for what future employers or college admissions officers might think when they Google students that are trying to rally for a position there, and looking at the available digital student footprints students have about them. So last two slides, many of us are thinking about digital technology and COVID. And I think those of us that study online learning in general really think that we're all in a pretty terrible environment to make online learning great, which I think it actually really can be great, though it does notably vary in quality. And my take is that this is like the worst case scenario to test online learning. Like people are just not supported right now to be able to do it. And the reason for that is that I think teachers at most public schools, particularly those serving less affluent students of color, are working in less than ideal conditions. Some teachers are still forced to teach in person and are quite literally risking their lives. And teachers have historically not had support for technology training. And I think this extends to the university level too, and they still don't have enough. We focus a lot on student skills, but I think teachers need training just like the rest of us, and there needs to be more of that. I also think that unlike pre-COVID, in-person schooling, where the debate was should cell phones even be allowed in school? Now you need technology to attend school, and so where learning is increasingly all online, the digital access gaps have certainly exacerbated. You can't just have a smartphone to participate. You need functional equipment. You need high quality internet. I've heard stories of kids driving to fast food parking lots to be able to connect to internet access they need to participate in class. So, really this underscores that hardware, software, internet access is in some ways a public good. And also, I think importantly, just because school members are increasingly going online, that doesn't mean racial and class biases are left to analog. Teachers, like the rest of us, are subject to racism and racist bias and need continued professional development to grow and mitigate these effects. And I think you all must have heard some of these stories, but these news reports of Zoom dress codes that are being imposed on kids, as if we all aren't wearing like pajamas halfway down right now, or even worse, these technologies that are starting to give rise to surveillance tools to track eye movement, to kind of make sure that even on Zoom, kids aren't cheating on exams. Um, I would bet that these approaches are not being used on wealthy white kids. I would bet top dollar. And so these are just kind of avenues through which we might see similar racism and classism extend online. And maybe I'll just kind of skip through to the end to get to discussion, but teaching pods is like a whole other thing that we could talk about if we want to. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Hopefully this was fun and interesting. I know everybody's got their own level of Zoom burnout at this point, but would love to just talk through what's interesting to you, talk through questions, and thanks for having me. I'll skip to the beginning because I've heard that apple can be a little distracting.
Thank you very much, Matt. I know I have some questions, but I get to go last and open the floor, so to speak, to anybody else who wants to ask you something about this. This is fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have a little bit of a simplistic question, and it might be open to opinion, but do you think now with, school being on Zoom, that digital play is either more or less visible and that the nature of the discipline is changing?
I would say I'm on the skeptical side of this. I think that it could be very visible, given that it is a digitally mediated environment and a lot of online play is digitally mediated. And so there could be opportunities to mess around with different social media platforms or whatever as part of a learning experience. I think that where that may be taking off is probably among privileged circles. I think the rise of teaching pods is one example of this. These are where a lot of wealthier families have smelled the smoke before the fire, and they know that public schools are not prepared right now to teach online effectively, and so they're hiring teachers to in different teaching pods mean different things, but in some cases it's hiring teachers to quarantine with their students and provide a tailored learning experience. And so when those are the resources you have, I would expect that play would make an appearance. But I think the teachers I've spoken with, particularly at public schools, particularly at schools serving less affluent students of color that are historically under-resourced, teachers are scared about COVID. They're not working in a collaborative environment. And I would expect in those contexts, play would be at the bottom of the list. And if anything, it would be threatening to the goals that they're trying to achieve. That would be my best guess.
Thank you.
Matt, did you see different, and maybe you didn't look at this, but social networks develop because of the different ways that students use their social media and online, time?
Could you say a little more? Do you have any particular hunches about that? Like, did they use Instagram versus something else? Or what do you mean by that?
So I guess I was more thinking about how with social media sites, how you can form sort of deeper relationships if you're using them in a certain way versus more topological or. So I'm thinking about just the connections over time. And I was also kind of thinking like if you were to follow these students past middle school, how their use of these social medias might change their social networks because of it.
Yep, it's a great question. I mean, I can't map to the after school stuff, but I think something that is interesting is that, and this gets to the chapter I didn't talk about, is that there was an effect that teachers' workplaces had on the structure of how people saw one another in terms of the relationships that they built, that I think did bleed into their technology use. So an example of this is at Sheldon. the schools serving Asian American kids. And pardon the meandering that I'm going to go here, but I'll promise I'll get back to it. So at Sheldon, the teachers there, when I interviewed them about their lives and their job, they described Sheldon as quite literally a hellhole. Like they hated working there. They described it was mostly women faculty there. They described the other women as like mean girls. They wouldn't let them sit with them at lunch. And as a result of this workplace dynamic, they came to see their teacher peers as threats. That was just kind of the normative relationship expectation, to be cautious and not collaborative. And being collaborative, developing relationships with other teachers was actually a risk. It would expose you. And so what teachers ended up doing, and this is part of the puzzle as to like what shapes their approach to digital play, is they saw other teacher peers as threats and they saw their students as threats too. And so they drew on this racialized imagery, not of model minorities, which they would do elsewhere, but as hackers. And what that did is it actually structured a threat orientation among students too. They came to see, like, teachers would create classroom experiences that pitted students against one another. They would use learning games as a way to publicly humiliate students that answered incorrectly. It basically created a reward system that felt more like an arena rather than a collaborative environment. And I saw signs of that ethos spill over digitally too. And one of the interesting bits of this that I'm finishing a paper that won't seem to die in terms of the revisions I need to do on it, but it affected harassment at that school. Students felt very isolated from one another at Sheldon. They would harass each other online and feel like there was no moral support from other students or from other faculty. It actually created a reward system for using social media in a way that was isolating and harassing and very hard to address. But at another school like Chávez, remember, they just thought it was irrelevant. They didn't thought it was like a police state per se. The reason why teachers saw themselves as like parents is because the school ethos was not mean girls. It was like a family. Apparently the school 10 years prior had evolved from an elementary school into a middle school, and they brought that ethos with them to that school environment. And so I would expect that same structuring of collaborative relationships. In fact, I know that's part of the paper I'm trying to argue, is that family-like dynamic helps students cultivate family-like relationships with one another. And when harassment occurred, even online, these kids would band together and try to help students out and figure out whether it was the bully or the person that was attacked, what was going on, to diffuse it. And so I would expect that those school dynamics had a meaningful relationship on how they used social media to form relationships or not, in ways that maybe could have set the tone for how they do that even beyond school. I'm not sure. So that was a long meandering, but hopefully I got at some of your question. This is
Other
really
questions
good
from
feedback.
Cool. Other questions from Matt? I'm working on a question, but I have an observation based on something fascinating that I learned today from this talk, and this is so much fun about. This is one of the things so much fun about talking to people across disciplines. So I'm not a sociologist. I tend to be focused more on psychological and micro interactional level stuff. So when a lot of the things you discussed today talked about effects on children and their development and their learning that are consistent with Robert Rosenthal's work on expectancy effects. So many of you will be familiar with the Pygmalion in the classroom studies Rosenthal did, Classics in Psychology, in social psychology. But this is the study which Rosenthal and his team from Harvard, they told, I think it was elementary school teachers, they had chosen at random, but they told teachers, based on testing, these children are going to show remarkable intellectual development over the course of the year. Now, it was just random assignment, but sure enough, because the teachers had those expectancies, they somehow interacted with the children in such ways that those children did actually show increases in IQ and other forms of accomplishment. Well, I've studied this area because a lot of research has gone into, well, what are those processes that take place when a teacher has this expectation? What are the interaction processes? And I hope you'll forgive me for being so pedantic about this, but I'm gonna take the screen back and show you something from
Yeah.
Rosenthal's research. And so if you can see, can you see this diagram? Great. So this is more detail than anybody ever wants to see about the Pygmalion and the classroom model. But this is Rosenthal's model of how expectancy effects operate. And in the middle is letter C. That's the interaction process between teachers and students, and that breaks down into a number of processes either. But in this schematic model, letter B is the proximal expectancy effect. So this is where the researchers say to the teachers that students number 1, 5, 9, and 12, they're gonna blow you away this year. So that's the experimentally induced expectancy effect. And here's Rosenthal's brilliance. Rosenthal says, you know, but there's other things that are going to intrude on the expectancies that a teacher has for a particular student or groups of students. And that's the distal independent variables, letter A. And I think that's a lot of what Matt talked to me about today. So letter A can be sociology, can be race, class, and economic privilege. Those are the things that are going to override and interact potentially with the expectancies that anybody has for an individual. So my knee-jerk reaction on here's a school and here's a school and here's a school is, well, there's going to be individual variation within that. And I'm thinking about Rosenthal and the expectancies. But this model helped me put many of these things into a broader and theoretically connected schema where these things will work. Of course, Rosenthal is also smart. He says, because here's where the interaction takes place. Here's the immediate outcome. D is the proximal outcome, where these certain select students actually show superior intellectual performance. But letter E is the distal performance. This is how they're going to do in life as a result of having had these opportunities to develop better than their peers. And so Matt gave me some ways to think about that too, that developing LinkedIn profiles is an outcome at level D that can affect the process of the future at level E. So I tend usually to think about B, C, and D. And this was a real wake-up call about how some other very tangible, very immediate, very important variables fit into these larger processes that are all theoretically true, but coming from different theoretical and social perspectives. I really enjoyed, you broadened my mind. And of course, I still don't have to abandon my little enclave of intellect, but you help me expand it in a way that I can understand. That's how we learn, is that we add things to the way that we can understand.
Well, and now I have another literature to dive into to get another perspective on this too. I mean, even thinking about Pierre Bourdieu, like I'm thinking about his work and I'm like, oh, like Bourdieu could be mapped to these different steps too. And like habitus is actually some of that earlier part, you know, and workplace culture could be the interaction kind of element. So, you know, really good lens from which to kind of tease out, you know, the same phenomena that we're all trying to figure out in slightly different ways.
Good. And this is one of the things that I found so impressive about Rosenthal's work, is that for decades, people have been saying, well, there are these self-fulfilling prophecy effects. If you think something is going to happen, then it happens. And we all said, yeah, there's lots of anecdotes that support that. Rosenthal said, okay, but it can't be magic. What really happens? And he looked into the micro level things of things. But you also remind me, Matt, about personal experience. In 1992, I moved to Evanston, Illinois, and I had a school-aged son. He was, I think, a third or fourth grader when we moved there. And when you move to Evanston, you either live in South Evanston or you live in North Evanston. And I could only afford to live in South Evanston. which is lower income, predominantly African American, where we used to say Black History Week is February in South Evanston. But the Evanston Unified School District, they knew about the disproportional access and privilege related to technology. And so the district had poured a lot of money into better computers in the South Evanston schools, hoping it would prevent white flight and allow permissive transfers. So students from North Evanston, their parents would send the students to the schools with these new computers in South Evanston. And what totally didn't work about that is that the kids in North Evanston, who had the much higher socioeconomic status and resources, they had brand new Macintoshes in their bedrooms. And the PTA, even though Evanston Unified School District controls district resources, the PTA is associated with different schools, and the PTA built a brand new Mac lab in North Evanston. So is it race? Well, it's race to the extent that race is so correlated with economic resources that despite everybody's best intentions, they ultimately are very difficult to separate again. It was amazing to see. And thanks for illuminating that by putting schools side by side. We saw two schools within the same district that had these kinds of inequalities. How it resulted, I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, these were unique selections. Like I selected on Tech Utopias because I think a lot of the rhetoric in ed tech is one-to-one laptop. Just send the tech and that will solve everything, which a lot of, tech researchers just think of as tech determinism. Like just giving you a technology doesn't net particular things. There's actually human beings involved, in how we organize as a people shapes how we use it. Yeah, I mean, my favorite example that I actually have in the book is Los Angeles Unified School District. They were a leader some years ago in providing the biggest investment in providing every kid in a predominantly Black and Latinx kind of serving district, every kid will have a technology. And one of the things that was really striking about that is that as they did that, students started playing with them and repurposing them. And that was a huge issue to this school. The fact that they were messing around with these technologies, the whole program was deemed like, quote, an I fail. The superintendent resigned. Like they even tried to tell Apple to get their money back because they weren't able to protect themselves from their students. And so I think it does speak to, race and class are certainly intersecting, but there's another piece of that, which is like, what are the assumptions that predominantly white people that are running these schools bringing to their kids and what they think their kids will do with them. I think there's a lot of work that white folks need to do to kind of unpack some of that and actually make teaching more equitable and more fun.
Cool. Any last comments or questions for Matt? Pardon me, for Matt today.
Matt, I have just one thing. I'm working on, so I run the Sustainable Technology Repair Initiative here on campus, and we're trying to bring like a tech resource for students, because right now we don't have anything like that for students. We have staff tech support, but we don't have student tech support. And so one of the things we're advocating for is and I'm working with Dr. Amy Gonzalez, who I believe is changing the measurement of access to include, like quality sustained access, so that it takes into account, the quality of your computer and the quality of your internet connection. But I'm also thinking about, again, how you mentioned these online skills, these digital skills, so online communication and production. So one of the things that we're doing is pulling together a latent class analysis to think about, and I haven't named it yet, but I'm thinking about it as like sort of thing like digital stability or something. And so since I have you here, what do you think about a latent measure that mixes skill and access to think of a more wider digital division measure?
So I love that. I love mixed methods approaches to tackling similar phenomena. I have a person to suggest for you, and that's Cassidy Puckett. She has been doing survey research on refining an instrument that she calls digital adaptability. She thinks that just discretely measuring if you have technology or not, or discretely measuring can you use Microsoft Word, that it's not enough, and that actually a better measure is some combination of the two, which gets at whether students and teachers can just adapt with digital technologies. And so if you check out her work, happy to connect you both too, but that might be some fun inspiration for different ways to tackle it.
Thank you very much. I think we could probably go on. I know there's more things I'd like to pick your brain about, but our hour has passed even despite the late start. And so I'll stop here. I'm sure people have places to go, but it's really been a pleasure to have you with us. Real eye opener. Thank you for sharing your research, some reflections on your career and your profession, and for teaching us something new today. Really fascinating. Thank you very much, Dr. Rafalow. Thanks for joining us, those of you who are still here, and we'll see you at the next CIS talk. We're lining 3 at this point, lining up 3 for winter quarter, and we'll be announcing those things when they come closer. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.